Hello, everybody. Good morning, and welcome to our webinar, Weed in the Workplace and How Marijuana Use Has Impacted Job Site Safety. I am very excited to have three really smart people here to bring you information about this particular topic, which is pretty important to all of you, as can be seen by the number of people enrolled in this webinar. So my name is Christina Anderson, and I'm the Safety Department Manager here at Corkhill Insurance, and I will be your moderator for today. I have Jacob Rakos with me on IT, so if you have any IT issues, please type them in the chat box. So we are privileged today to have Jeff Risch, Commander Brian Cluever, and Jennifer Bash today sharing important information on employer rights and responsibilities, DUI law and enforcement, and the science behind drug testing. It's important to have a robust drug-free workplace program with the insurance of the law and science and technology on your side. So we hope that at the end of this webinar, you will feel empowered to have drug-free workplace programs and to test employees who you suspect may be under the influence of drugs and alcohol. The webinar will be about 1 hour and 10 minutes, followed by a question and answer session. I do want to remind employees that you are muted, so please do raise your hand or use the chat box if you have questions. I also want to remind you that the webinar is being recorded and that if you do not want to be recorded, and this includes comments in the chat box, you can go ahead and exit the webinar now, and you will receive a follow-up email with the webinar recording. All right. Okay, so with that, I'd like to begin the webinar by briefly introducing you to each of our speakers. They will, in turn, each provide you with additional information about themselves as we move forward through the webinar. First up will be Jeff Risch. Jeff is the chair of Smith Amundsen's Expansive Management Side Labor Employment Practice Group. Jeff oversees a team providing comprehensive counsel to employers across the country. He is a prolific author and presenter, and I can attest to that. He's done several webinars for us. He literally wrote the book on labor and employment law for Illinois employers through the Illinois Chamber of Commerce. If you have ever been lucky enough to see Jeff present, you will know you are in excellent hands in any negotiation or courtroom. The topics that Jeff will be speaking on include employer responsibility and liability regarding implementing a drug testing program that covers THC in an ever-changing legal landscape, and medicinal versus recreational marijuana and why there is indeed a major difference between the two for employers to note. Next up will be Commander Brian Cluever. Brian is the patrol commander for the Carroll Stream Police Department. He spent most of his career in the department's Traffic Investigations Unit, where he developed and implemented numerous traffic safety and education enforcement programs focused on impaired driving enforcement, commercial vehicle enforcement, and traffic crash investigation. Brian also oversaw his department's drug impaired driving program, zero tolerance DUI search warrant program, forensic phlebotomy program, and I am so proud of myself for getting through that word, and oral fluid testing pilot program. Brian is a NHTSA NHTSA certified standardized field sobriety test instructor and is trained in advanced roadside impaired driving enforcement. He also serves as the Director of Transportation Safety Programs with the Illinois Truck Enforcement Association. His topics will be emerging trends in cannabis possession and consumption and law enforcement's response to recent changes in drug DUI law, and enforcement methods, roadside technology testing, and training utilized by law enforcement. And then our final presenter will be Jennifer Bash. Jennifer is currently a senior analytical forensic toxicology specialist, holding a board certification in forensic toxicology. She works at the Analytical Forensic Testing Laboratory at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Jennifer has spent the past 15 years working in forensics as a toxicologist analyzing biological samples for compounds of interest, and is currently helping expand the testing capabilities of the AFTL. She also serves as the quality manager. Jennifer earned her master's in organic chemistry from Northwestern University, performing research in the field of nanotechnology before beginning her career in forensic science. Jennifer has become a well-recognized and respected member of the forensic community in Illinois, both as a scientist and as an expert witness. She is also a sought-after scientific consultant in growing medical cannabis field and an adjunct professor in forensic science. Jennifer's topic will be the science behind roadside testing and some of the pitfalls of current legislation as it relates to forensic toxicology. So without any further ado, we will go ahead and have Jeffrey Risch present his part of the presentation. Thank you, Jeff.
All right, great. Well, thank you. So let me make sure I got right. Just want to make sure that I have the presentation up here and ready to go. Okay, so we'll just get right into it. You know, I am not a scientist. I have virtually no medical training whatsoever, and tried to take the least amount of science classes as possible in my high school and college career, and went to law school for reasons in part because I don't do math, I don't do science, but I know the law, and I can tell you that, you know, you can just read the newspaper, right, and figure out there's a lot of marijuana being consumed. Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, or you're not really sure. I personally, I'm the grumpy old man waving the newspaper at the kids that throw the ball in my yard. I'm one of those. But that said, I want to make sure that we have and there's a, I don't know where it comes. I think there was a auto corrector. The first month of sales in 2020 was not $39 billion. It was $39 million. Must have been an autocorrect when I was finalizing the slides. We since the beginning of the year, we've sold, I think the state surpassed $1 billion. So the point here is that employers, it's inevitable that you have employees consuming marijuana and cannabis. You are hiring employees consuming marijuana, and whether it's medicinal or recreational, the impact on the employment on the employment side, I think it's the same from a viewpoint of trying to maintain a safe and healthy workplace. So I'm attacking this entire discussion through the lens of an employment law attorney that exclusively represents management and employers and all things from traditional labor to traditional employment. So you have, or you have, the statistics would probably bear out that you have people in your workplace that are consuming cannabis, or will soon have those employees in your workplace. And with the downturn, not the downturn, but with the tight labor market, the ever increasing tight labor market, beggars can't be choosers, so to speak. And so I'm starting to see and hear about more and more employers taking a different approach, at least on a temporary basis, with respect to testing and terminating employees that for the consumption impairment related to cannabis. And I'll talk more about that as we go through the material here this morning. But, you know, the impact, the overall impact in this entire subject it's still very much blurred in the courts and before labor arbitrators and administrative tribunals. There's a lot of this is not clear, and it's still unfocused. And as we grapple with the law and the statutory changes in Illinois, first medicinal and then recreational, be mindful that the legislature in Illinois and throughout the country, it's not just an Illinois thing, but even outside of Illinois, the state capitals are very busy changing, revising, updating their medicinal and or recreational laws. So this is not static, and it will continue to develop and change from a legal lens. Now, unfortunately, most states, and specifically Illinois, doesn't have a civil immunity for employers. You're sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And it's unfortunate, and it is what it is. And employers need to be mindful that there is no civil immunity. You are liable if you do not take reasonable efforts to maintain a safe and healthy workplace. You are potentially liable if you have workers that are impaired, and impairment, we can go on and on. Others will focus on impairment and what that actually means. But from an employment standpoint, if you have employees that are using for medicinal use or recreational use, and they have the cannabis in their system, the THC in their system, and something horrible happens, you're not immune from liability. And so you've got to keep that in mind from a civil liability with third parties, from a work comp liability perspective. You need to keep this in mind. So I'm really zeroed in on Illinois cannabis law. I know most of you are operating in Illinois, and where I can kind of get to a more national approach, I will, but I like using Illinois as an example because, like most states, Illinois started with medicinal, and then from medicinal, then you've got recreational. Medicinal always, it's funny how that works. Medicinal always comes before recreational, and so usually in my experience, it's not that far after the medicinal is passed, and then you start seeing the recreational take root. Pun intended. So the employer liability, the law, when the Illinois legislature created and was signed by Governor Pritzker, and this is kind of true in most states where you have recreational cannabis, they've allowed employers to adopt policies, including zero tolerance policies. So employers can prohibit employees from using, possessing, and this is fairly universal. I mean, employers, you can prohibit employees from using, possessing, or being impaired by cannabis, whether it's medicinal or recreational, in the workplace. And employers, you can define the workplace. It's not just the brick and mortar of a building or a facility or a plant or a job site. It could be, on roadways. It can extend into your parking lots. It can extend onto your premises that you lease or own, or while performing jobs or while on call. So that remote worker, you're working, you should not be using cannabis even in the comforts of your own home. If it was even otherwise lawful or legal, you shouldn't be using it or being impaired by it because you are on the job, you're on the proverbial clock. And there's nothing preventing an employer now from implementing these types of policies and then taking the adverse action against an employee for violating those policies. That's recreational. That is also includes the medicinal law in Illinois. Now, there's more. There's more. Of course, if an employer has a good faith belief that somebody may be impaired or under the influence of cannabis in the workplace, performing their job while on call, the employers, you can lawfully take action. You can lawfully take action to correct that type of behavior, or again, through a zero tolerance policy, say, I don't want that, and you're terminated, and take very decisive adverse action. So, the recreational law in Illinois has been pretty pro-employer. If you look at it from 10,000 feet, it's been generally pro-employer. And so where I'm starting to see companies gravitate now, because of the tight labor market, is considering relaxing the zero tolerance with respect to THC, because I can't get anyone to come in and make the donuts if I'm continuing to prevent folks from the job, withdrawing job offers due to a positive drug test result. You need to keep in mind, if you're even contemplating that or exercising that you are still on the hook, so to speak, if something were to happen from a safety standpoint, from an injury or a property damage standpoint. You're going to be judged as what you should have known, what you could have known, had you had taken action and continued to implement a drug testing policy that includes THC. So where I'm going with this is, I'm starting to see companies relax the THC rules or rules relating to cannabis in their drug testing policies and protocols. And so I think that that's okay, generally speaking, from a standpoint of you need people to make the donuts. But I would caution you of if you're completely eliminating it and not even taking note of the THC and not managing it, I think that is risky. I think that has a lot of risk to it, because if you fail to test, and you could have tested, and you would have known, you would have had knowledge, you would have been able to better manage the particular employee and take protocols and measures to try and diminish risks associated with the fact that somebody is using cannabis products. Now,
Jeff, I have a question. Could that then
Sure.
result in negligent entrustment lawsuits?
Yeah, and I make note of that in the presentation, but yet for sure, there's a negligent retention, negligent management, negligent oversight. You're going to be judged on what you should have done. And really, if you're really talking about employees that are in safety sensitive positions, moving equipment, using machinery, driving vehicles, and hurting another if they hurt another employee, that's why you have work comp insurance, right? If they hurt a non-employee, that's why you have liability insurance. And I don't know what your limits are and what your coverage includes in your liability insurance, but there are scenarios where you're not going to have enough liability insurance to cover horrific ripple effect of something really bad happening. So when we talk about, and I think that some employers kind of say, I want to try and segue to another topic. A lot of employers, especially in Illinois, have been almost like have been beaten up to believe that, oh, this is a privacy issue. There's nothing that, you know, we can't prevent people from consuming lawful products and what they're doing in their own home outside of work. And there's some truth to that. But under the current law in Illinois, and a lot of states adopt very similar laws, the law on privacy, you still can't be using or being under the influence or being impaired or possessing these products in the workplace. So it's very similar to alcohol. Alcohol has been, in the sense of privacy, alcohol has been legal and lawful for those that are of the legal age. Same with recreational medicinal cannabis. And while I can't use the fact that somebody is using this product, this otherwise lawful product recognized under specific state law, I can't use the fact that they're using that in the privacy of their own home. I can use the fact that you're now becoming my employee, you're now employed, and I can control you from an employment perspective. I can create reasonable work rules, because I'm a private employer, that would prohibit you from using it in the workplace or while performing your job, or being impaired. And it's just similar to alcohol. And I don't want to steal someone else's thunder, and I understand that we're going to hear on impairment and what that means. But from a legal lens, an employer really does control through their policy, at least as of today, has the control to create policies. They could, you might think that those policies are trivial, you might think that those policies are unfair, but an employer can generally implement rules and policies that regulates and controls their workplace. And that an employee does not have a unfettered right to continue to use and have ingest THC products in their system and continue their employment unchecked. And that is a very, very important piece from the employment lens that I want to stress today. Under the medicinal marijuana law, and this is pretty much universal, but specific to Illinois, we can't take action, adverse action against somebody simply because they're a registered user. But having said what I've just said, I still try to focus from use to impairment. And I think that that's where the developing case law is going in all of this. It's important for employers, if they're going to take adverse action against somebody who's using marijuana and not in conformity with your policies and rules, I think it's really important to do what we can to document symptoms by trained management personnel, or have some fact pattern documented that tends to support the fact that they may be impaired. And I'm not a scientist, I'm not a medical doctor, and the employers, you're not medical doctors, you're not scientists, but you have a reasonable belief or there's facts that tend to support some behavior or symptom of impairment, as well as some tests that would confirm positive presence of THC and cannabis in the system. Now, to kind of get through this as quickly as I can for sake of time, the Illinois law actually does recognize what these symptoms may be. It's not an exhaustive list, but there is an actual reference in the law to symptoms of marijuana use in the workplace. Believe it or not, they actually codified it under Illinois, under the Illinois law. And so this is just a laundry list on slide number 9 of symptoms that the Illinois legislator legislature has adopted that employers should note. Another thing, just to keep in mind, we talked about civil liability, but an employee really in Illinois specific really only has a right to bring claims under the Privacy in the Workplace Act. And those remedies are pretty limited. I just want employers to note that an employee's right to complain about privacy related to cannabis, it is very limited, at least at this time. But going to what you said earlier, if you don't do anything, if you lax your policy, if you completely eliminate THC, just something for you to consider is negligent hiring, retention, supervision. And as you implement your policies, you want to do so fairly and equally, because we want to avoid wrongful termination, discrimination, disability claims, right? We want to try and avoid those as best we can. None of what I'm talking about has anything to do with DOT regulated employees. Employees that are regulated by the United States Department of Transportation, the mere use of marijuana, at least as of today, is improper and is prohibited. Just to fast forward this a little bit, because of time, I want to make sure I get time for the other speakers. This is a good slide of the different types of testing that employers can implement. Pre, post-offer screening of candidates, random drug testing, post-accident, post-incident testing, reasonable suspicion, caught in the act, return to work, follow-up testing, maybe through a last chance agreement, and of course, DOT drug testing. But how employers implement those different triggers is going to be unique to the employer and with an eye on safety sensitive. I would not have anyone be subject to random testing if they're not in a bona fide safety sensitive position. And in line with some developing case law, and there's case law that I'm not gonna go into because of time, but it's in the material in case anybody wants to reference it. The trend line here is courts and the legislatures that are backing this type of legislation having an eye on protecting the medicinal use. So where I'm going with this is in the pre-employment phase or post-offer phase of drug testing, the medicinal user that might have THC, probably does have THC in their system if they were tested and would test, positive for it potentially. Unless they're in a safety sensitive position, my advice right now is to eliminate pre-employment or post-offer, drug testing with respect to THC, unless the person is being employed in a safety-sensitive position. And I think that's the trend line. And this is my last point that I want to make here, and I'll turn it over due to time, is the Illinois Vehicle Code. That some states, not all, but some states have created, they have a vehicle code where they try to create levels. And this is an important slide. I'm not going to get into the science behind this. Quite frankly, I don't understand all the science behind it. But there's nothing that prevents an employer from adopting a policy that measures impairment or concludes that you must be impaired because you have tested positive. If the positive test, if there's a positive test, the employer can rely on that, so long as that test result is measuring the presence of the THC in the system at a level that exceeds 10 nanograms in any bodily substance, or 10 or 5 nanograms in whole blood. And so this is just a short summary of the Illinois Vehicle Code. We've got other people that are experts on the vehicle code, not me. But my point here is simple. The legislatures have particularly in Illinois, the Illinois legislators specifically, have basically said, employers, if you test an employee and that test result comes back as positive, and that positive presence of THC exceeds what the Illinois Vehicle Code, the limits that the Illinois Vehicle Code has implemented, then you can do whatever you want. You can presume the person is impaired. You can take adverse action. We're not going to question you. Right, wrong, or indifferent. That's what the legislators have basically said in the statutory framework of cannabis law in Illinois. I can tell you, I'll leave you with this, that what I just described is something that I think's not going to go away anytime soon. And there is a voice in Springfield that is trying to get new law, and I think it's likely to pass sometime next year, where the law would be, employers, you cannot rely solely on a positive test result to take adverse action against an employee, whether it's medicinal or recreational use of cannabis. However, if the test result it shows that they have THC in their system that exceeds the legal limits under the Illinois Vehicle Code, you can do whatever you want. I'll leave you with that. I'll turn it over to the other speakers, and then we can, address Q&A at the end.
Thank you, Jeff. I believe that your presentation has left a lot of our attendees feeling more empowered than they were before learning about what you had to say. So thank you very much. All right, at this point, we will go ahead and transfer to Brian.
All right, how's that look?
Perfect.
Okay. All right, I'm glad that I had the second spot in this presentation because there were a lot of things that Jeff covered in his presentation that I think we can transition into in mine. What I want to do though is really kind of set the stage here, what we're going to talk about, and specifically how what we're seeing in law enforcement has a direct nexus to what you are seeing in the safety industry and what you all do. I'm going to focus a lot on impaired driving just because that's my area of expertise, but more importantly is the fact that every one of you have employees, and even though we have people working from home, every one of you have employees that have to get to work one way or another, and a lot of you have employees that drive as a part of their job. And it's important for you to understand the trends that we're seeing and how that could potentially impact your bottom line and the overall safety and the culture within your organization. So I want to talk about the current culture and attitude, not just within the state of Illinois, but within the nation, as it relates to cannabis consumption, cannabis use, and possession in general. I'll talk a little bit about the impact of the pandemic on traffic safety overall, but also how it impacted and increased actually the use of illicit drugs and cannabis during that time period, and obviously we're still going through it. And then some trends that we see in cannabis use, some types that you might want to keep an eye open for. And then we'll talk about drug-impaired driving detection and end off with chemical testing methods, which will, I think, lead very well into what Jennifer will speak about later. So when I talk about culture and attitude, there was obviously the decriminalization of cannabis in Illinois, and it has been happening across the country, both for medicinal purposes and recreational. And I have a map later on that'll kind of spell out all the areas where that's occurring. But what's actually happening is there's a normalization of cannabis within the culture of the United States. And like I said, not just Illinois, and the attitude toward it. And that's evident by the IIHS study, which was done in 2020, but reported in 2021, that shows that 68% of adults approve of the decriminalization of cannabis. So we're seeing a much different attitude on a national basis now towards cannabis. So whether we like it or not, whether us in the safety industry or in law enforcement like it, we have to understand that times are changing. and that when you speak in groups like this, that I used to be able to think with a lot of confidence that most people were against this. I actually have to pull back from that now because that's clearly not the case. Although in this circle, it may still be the case that we don't really approve of it. But that's neither here nor there. What we've also seen, though, is that it's not just people approving of other people using cannabis. We've seen a rise in the number of people that are actually consuming cannabis. So between 2008 and 2019, we saw cannabis use throughout the nation raise from 6% of the population to 12% of the population. So it doubled in that time frame. And again, what happened during that time frame was a lot of jurisdictions, a lot of states started to legalize cannabis and started to kind of repaint the picture of what cannabis actually is. It's no longer this taboo thing. So we've seen that rise. And now this was taken before the beginning of the pandemic. I can say with all but 100% certainty that this number is probably much higher today, post-pandemic. I don't want to say post-pandemic because we're still in it, but after going to the beginning of the pandemic. What's more alarming, especially to me as a law enforcement official, and should be to you as employers, is that self-reported data showed in 2020 or 2019 that 12.8 million people reported driving under the influence of cannabis. That's extremely alarming because these are just people that are saying, yeah, I did that, not the people that are kind of keeping it to themselves. So something that we definitely need to look out for and have metrics in place to deal with that. We've also seen increased accessibility for cannabis. Obviously, there's dispensaries out there. You no longer have to go into a dark alley and meet with a shady drug dealer to get your cannabis. You know, you can go and buy it in a retail setting, a safe, comfortable, and they're actually very nice facilities. They have people that serve you there that are called bud tenders that can tell you what kind of cannabis that would best suit you. It's a very robust system that they have in place. So it's accessible now much more than it was in the past. And what we've seen because of that accessibility is a new demographic of users. Prior to the decriminalization, anybody wouldn't just go out and buy cannabis. You had a demographic of people that were rule followers that wouldn't do it simply because it was illegal. They may want to try it, but they wouldn't because it was illegal at the time. And now what you've seen is that that's kind of gone by the wayside. Well, if J.B. Pritzker and all of his friends down in Springfield say it's okay and it's not illegal anymore, who am I to say I shouldn't do it? And I can tell you from my observations, these aren't the people that we're seeing cause the issues. It's the habitual users that were habitual users before the decriminalization. Not to say that these people don't contribute to the issue, but it's not a majority of them. However, it is a new demographic being introduced into this whole culture. The softer approach by the court system we've seen time and time again. That's on a national basis for a lot of different things. But when we start decriminalizing small amounts of cannabis, the larger amounts seem to be not such a big deal because the smaller amounts aren't criminal at all. And I'll show you some examples of that later on through here. And then marketing. You know, you see billboards, you hear radio advertisements. They're marketing the fact that cannabis is decriminalized to everybody that can listen. And that's an issue when it comes to the marketing to younger individuals. So I have this picture here, and I talk about normalization. If you look at this sticker that says Best Buds. So this was on a dashboard of actually the vehicle that you show that's shown above here, where we're doing field sobriety tests on the individual. I can tell you in my 16 years in law enforcement, people are becoming much more confident in their in what they're doing to advertise that they use cannabis. So in the past, people would kind of want to hide the fact that there might be cannabis in the car or that they use cannabis, not put a giant goofy sticker on their dashboard to indicate that they approve at the very least of cannabis. Now, obviously, this isn't probable cause for anything, but you couple this with the strong odor of cannabis coming out of the car and some other symptoms that this person was displaying, and you're starting to make a pretty decent case for yourself for a cannabis DUI. So again, these things that used to be hidden no longer are. It's become normalized, and it's something that I think we're going to have to deal with regardless of how we feel about it. So we talk about the impact of the pandemic. I think just overall, it's important to realize one thing, that traffic crashes, all traffic crashes in general, we saw fewer vehicle miles traveled, actually a decrease of 13.2% from 2019 to 2020. So there were fewer vehicle miles traveled. There were fewer vehicles going further and traveling those long distances in that time. A lot of people were working from home and everything like that. But what we did see was a 7.2% increase in traffic fatalities, which was the first time in I want to say almost a decade, that number had increased and not decreased. We'd been seeing a pretty steady trend of about 37,000, 36,000 and some change for the past several years. And again, we saw fewer vehicle miles traveled, but yet we saw an increase in fatalities, which is concerning. And a lot of that is because the people that were on the road were engaging in more dangerous behaviors. We saw an increase in speeding, a lack of occupant protection use, seatbelt use, and obviously impaired driving. Those are things that are dangerous in and of themselves, but then you add any of them together and they compound on top of each other. And now you're looking at, again, more bodies piling up on the roadways when we should be at a time where people are so concerned about public health crises and so concerned about other people that we should be taking this into consideration as well. Yet we clearly didn't as a nation, which was an issue. And I can tell you, again, from my observations during the pandemic, speed was out of control. I bet you that most of you have probably seen the same thing. And we're still trying to recover from that from almost 2 years ago now from when this started. So that those have been issues and that contributed to those fatalities. There is a silver lining, I guess, if you want to call it that, is that fatalities involving large trucks decreased by 2%. So for some of you that are in the transportation industry, that's good news. It's a relatively small decrease, but it's a win nonetheless. And a lot of that, in my opinion, is probably because there were fewer small vehicles traveling on the roadway, which we know, if any of you are in the transportation industry or commercial vehicle industry, know that those smaller vehicles tend to be the ones that cause the problems more so than the trucks and the truck drivers themselves. So we talk about current trends. I think it's important to recognize this. You heard the term THC tossed around in Jeff's presentation. He did a good job of kind of explaining how that's represented in the law, and Jen will do an even better job, I have no doubt in my mind, explaining what that actually means. But when we talk about THC, that's the impairing compound within cannabis itself. And there's a couple other subsections that, again, Jen will talk about. I don't want to get into that too much, but THC is generally how we determine, the level of impairment that someone is going to be at. Well, it's not perfect, and I'll talk about that in a bit. It can be measured in the different types of products. So I like to refer to this old Cheech and Chong photo where he's smoking this giant, what we would call a super doobie. Back in those days, when you're looking at the THC content within flower cannabis, which would be smoked in a blunt, you're looking at in the 70s, about 3%, and then moving up to about 5%. And that was pretty much the trend all the way into the late 90s. And what you're seeing now with this specific chart is that in 2019, 2018-ish, you're looking at 15%. We've seen THC contents in flower cannabis as high as 30%, which is significantly higher than what people were used to in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even in the 90s. So realistically, Cheech and Chong smoking that giant joint, that's something that they would probably have to smoke, that entire thing, to get the same THC content that they were getting back in today, that they were getting back in the 70s and 80s. So we've seen a huge rise in that, and that is only the beginning of the issues when it comes to impairment. There's different types of cannabis or different types of vessels in which THC is contained and which people are consuming. Some of the other trends that we've seen, an increase in possession quantities. I mean, back in the day, even 5, 6, 7 years ago, prior to the decriminalization, we weren't seeing large quantities of cannabis being transported or possessed by people. That's definitely changed. This is a picture of one of our cases, which is more recently. This is about 2 pounds of weed. I left this picture in with the cache there because it gives you an idea of the size of what we're seizing off the street. This is not legally purchased cannabis, by the way. The legalization or decriminalization of cannabis does not put a dent in the illegal cannabis industry by any stretch of the imagination. So we're still seeing these quantities coming. Now, this isn't something that we're pulling out of a car every single day, but it is coming out much more significantly than we've seen in the past. And what I talked about before was these more lax criminal justice policies. We've seen that things like this, where this would clearly in the past would have been a felony charge. This would be a battle now to be a felony charge. 2 pounds of cannabis with money in rubber bands. Clearly this person is dealing, but it's not enough. We need to have a scale. We need to have an admission. And again, that's kind of just how society has created this bubble that kind of says, cannabis isn't that big of a deal anymore, so let's not be too hard on these people. Again, none of this is legal, what they have in here. This isn't bought at a dispensary by any stretch of the imagination. So those are kind of things that we're seeing. So on top of that, besides for the flower cannabis that we're seeing an increase, a huge increase in THC vapes or oils. So you've all seen the vape pens that are out there. You guys all understand the fact that those can be used to consume THC oil just as well as nicotine. And you would be none the wiser as employers if you're allowing people to use vape pens. You would be none the wiser. It's odorless in a lot of cases, and you wouldn't be able to discern between nicotine fluid and THC oil unless you looked at it really, really hard. THC oil tends to be a little bit thicker, almost like a syrup, as opposed to the nicotine, which is more of a fluid and liquid consistency. And then we've also seen things like this. So this is THC wax. That 2 pounds that I just showed you, when we got this seizure out of the car, basically the person that we arrested told us that he had to use 2 pounds of flower cannabis to extract the THC wax, which is what this is. That's how it's done. They extract all the THC out of the flower to create this basically pure form of THC, which can be consumed. So 2 pounds of flower cannabis ended up being this amount of wax that you see here. Now, when I talked about flower cannabis having a high end of 30% THC, this particular THC or this particular wax usually goes between 90 to 95% THC. So significantly higher, extremely impairing. It takes a very small amount to get a person to the point where they're impaired. But yet this is what we're seeing. These are the trends that we're seeing out there. Flower cannabis is kind of going by the wayside. It'll always be there. Again, it's the cheapest, it's the easiest to obtain most likely, and it'll always be there. But we're seeing an increase in the oils and the waxes. And again, you can smell this actually has a very strong smell. So this might not be the one that can get past you as employers, but nonetheless, if you looked at this just sitting in someone's vehicle, if you were doing an inspection or at their workspace, would you know what it is? That's the whole goal of this seminar, is to make you aware of these types of things and the things that we're seeing. And then also edibles. Edibles are sitting between 50 and 90% THC content. Some are lower, obviously, and they come in a whole bunch of different forms. And the problem I have with these are that they're mirroring what actual candy looks like, which is like sacrilegious to me personally, especially with Starburst. But how can a kid discern between one or the other? And then more importantly, if you just took a quick look at this as an employer, would you know the difference? These things, again, are being consumed. And the alarming part about edibles is this: they don't interact with the body right away. So a person won't feel the high right away because they're not smoking it. They're not consuming it in a traditional way. They're eating it. It takes a little bit longer for it to process in the body and to actually get that high. So what people end up doing is consuming more. So if they have one gummy bear and they say, hey, I'm not feeling it, they might have 2 or 3 or 4 more. Well, a regular dose, a recommended dose, may only be 1 gummy bear. It just takes a while for it to kick in. And after 4, 5, 6 gummy bears, now they get this extreme high because it all comes at one time, and they're incredibly intoxicated or impaired, and they didn't mean to do so. So we've seen what we'll call overdoses of it, not the traditional sense, but to the point where this does not, people that are highly, highly intoxicated by this type of THC content, is they're not distributing this, or this, they're not showing the same signs and symptoms that you would see from a person that's just smoked cannabis regular. It looks much different. The impairment looks much different. So when we look at the challenges that are facing law enforcement, specifically as it relates to impaired driving, the decriminalization, without a second question about it, is impacting how we're doing our jobs and our ability to do our jobs, because it made those items legal in a lot of cases. Again, we're not seeing a huge increase in the possession of those legal items necessarily, but it's opened up kind of the floodgates to make us question ourselves whether or not something is legal or whether it is. As it relates to impaired driving, there's a massive lack of research into what impaired by cannabis actually means. When you look at alcohol, going all the way back to the 1920s and 30s, even before that actually, we've had research into alcohol impairment. We've been very comfortable to say that a per se limit, which means that everybody at this point is intoxicated, is a 0.08. That number has changed from back in the 20s. It actually started off at a 0.15, which is inconceivable of today's standards. But we're down to a 0.08 in 49 of the states and a 0.05 in Utah. But all of that has been researched and proved time and time again, and there's data to support the fact that people do experience impairment at that level. We do not have that same type of validated research with cannabis. A lot of that is because cannabis is still illegal federally, and that there hasn't been a lot of research into it because of that. It's been hard to really dig your teeth into that type of stuff and do a lot of research on it because of its legal status. The availability of tools for law enforcement is a huge part, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. We don't have a viable roadside test that can be used for evidentiary purposes to detect THC in a person's system per what our legislators want, which again I'll talk about in the next slide. And I kind of already talked about the evidentiary tests for roadside use. I'll talk about oral fluid testing, and then I'm sure Jen will have a lot to say about that as well. We've collaborated on a lot of those things, and we kind of came to the same conclusion, but I'll let her tell you, not me. So I really do believe that when it comes to detecting impaired drivers, the observations of a police officer, a well-trained professional police officer, are the best tool for identification, and the training of our officers is vital. So when you look at DUI enforcement, there's 3 types of training that an officer can go through. There's standardized field sobriety tests, proficiency training, which they go through in the academy, and that's your basic DUI enforcement, where you put people through field sobriety tests. You understand what alcohol impairment looks like. Very little drug impairment is taught in that class, but that's what the average police officer, the knowledge base and their training, that's the average officer's level of training in impaired driving. Above that is advanced roadside impaired driving enforcement, or ARIDE, which is extremely important. It lets you dive into the 7 drug categories that are out there and kind of look at what you would be seeing and the type of impairment that you would be seeing per each drug category. But by no means does it even hold a flame to a drug recognition expert. So this type of training is the most advanced training that a police officer can get related to impaired driving. Currently, I have a map on the side here. This is 2008 numbers, and the last time that I spoke with one of our lead DREs here a couple days ago, he said in Illinois there's about 150 DREs in Illinois, with about 30 or 40 of them actively practicing. Some have been promoted, some of them are maybe on day shift now, so they don't do as much as they used to, which is, it goes without saying there's impaired people there during the day, but nonetheless. So you're looking at 150 police officers in the state of Illinois. If you look nationally, we're looking at what, a couple thousand people that are trained as a drug recognition expert. DREs can basically, they're trained, it's a very intense course that they take, where they learn the 7 drug categories. They learn basically every single aspect of how that drug will impact the human body. In order for them to make a recommendation or a conclusion on what someone is under the influence of, they do a full DRE evaluation, which involves not only field sobriety tests, but taking blood pressure, pulse, measuring pupil size, doing some other physical and cognitive testing to really see what's impairing this person. It's a very time-consuming process, and it's not an easy thing for an officer to do. And we'll never see a day where all 70,000 or 700 or 800,000 police officers that we have in the United States are DREs. And we should never see that day, because it requires a great deal of dedication and knowledge and passion in order to be good at being a DRE. I like to compare it to this. You wouldn't take every single police officer without passion, without knowledge, and put them as a sniper on a SWAT team, right? There's people that aren't qualified to do that. There's people that don't have an interest in it. You want to take the best of the best for those things, and that's the same thing as the DRE program. So we've seen challenges in court and over-reliance on technology. The courts want to see this Delta-9 THC that we're testing for. They want to see that number. The officer's opinion, the officer's observations aren't really measured very well in court. They don't really put a lot of weight behind that, which is unfortunate. So those are things that we need to kind of get past. A lack of comprehensive understanding for THC, poor legislation, which was talked about in Jeff's presentation, and then also the sympathetic judges and juries. We've seen this happen time and time again, where again cannabis is decriminalized. So we're kind of looking at people that are a little more sympathetic to people that have possession of it or are under the influence of it. And also cannabis impairment looks entirely different than alcohol impairment, especially on video. So those are things that we're kind of challenged by. Currently, the only evidentiary testing available to law enforcement is blood and urine. So blood is great, and urine is also great for us, but we can't collect it roadside. And I'm going to kind of try to speed through these things. I know I'm going over on time here. So those are things, blood and urine, we can collect back at the station once the person's been arrested, but we don't have any viable testing for roadside use. So oral fluid testing is up and coming. It can be viable for roadside use once the technology is mastered, which it is not at this point. It's less invasive than blood and urine testing. It is capable of detecting active THC, so they say, but there are some issues with it in that the sensitivity levels on these oral fluid testing, whether it's the simple one like I showed you or a more advanced electronic one, sensitivity levels don't reach what we need for the 10 nanograms of delta 9 THC in a person's system. What we're seeing is that the lowest levels of detection is almost 25. Some people claim they can go a little bit lower than that, but even so, at 25 nanograms, that's still 2.5 times what the legal limit is. So that's not going to be good for us. They haven't really had any answers for mouth contamination or cross reactivity for false positives, and that's kind of a concern for us as well. And I'm sure Jen will talk about that. I don't want to take up any more of her time. I apologize for speeding through that at the end, but that's my contact information. I look forward to questions after we're all done here.
Thank you so much, Commander Cluever. I really appreciate that information. And at this time, we will go ahead and transition to Jennifer Bash. And Jennifer, again, will be talking to us about the toxicology and the science behind all of this.
All right, can everybody see it?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
All right. I'm going to kind of hold off on some of my slides. And also, I always really like to take questions. So if there are questions, please just feel free to start throwing them up in the chat box, because that's really kind of where my emphasis comes on. I'm always the resident nerd, and I have come to just kind of embrace that. I'm the person that people bring in when they want to understand science. I totally understand that not many people enjoy science as much as I do. That's why I call myself the resident nerd. I do teach art students, and so teaching science to art students has taught me a lot of tools and tricks in how to actually explain something where it won't feel so pedantic or so boring. I try not to be the really old crotchety professor. Just kind of touching on some of the stuff that Brian had brought up. He is absolutely correct regarding the levels of THC that we're seeing in plants. With the fact that I've done consulting in the cannabis community, California actually has a, they call it the Emerald Bowl every year. It is a competition for the cultivators to grow the highest concentration flower that they can. They have gotten it up to 85 or 90% in a couple times. It's absolutely astounding how much the plant has changed over the years. And so the big thing with the THC amounts increasing in the plant, plus what Brian also brought up, the fact that you have vape products now that can be easily 90%. You have the actual like wax products that are also very much more potent or concentrated than the plant material. The issue with that is most people think of THC or cannabis in that Cheech and Chong kind of setting. From a toxicology standpoint, cannabis has always kind of been in its own sort of semi-different category, but it truly is a hallucinogen. And people usually, when I say that to them, they're like, what do you mean THC is hallucinogen? It is. THC is a hallucinogenic drug. But people are like, well, it doesn't act like LSD or ketamine or anything like that. What do you mean? The problem is that how a hallucinogenic drug can affect people is also going to be based upon the dose that they take. So that means that before people would smoke the very lower concentrated 4 to 5% plant, they wouldn't be getting that dose. The other thing, and Brian kind of touched on this too, is how you actually ingest a drug product. How you ingest a drug product changes dramatically how it actually affects you. Smoking is basically like injecting it. It goes into the lungs, into the alveoli, and it's whoop, instantly into the blood. The thing that happens when you're smoking something, and this is why habitual drug users, if they can smoke a drug compound, they will, because it's an instant feeling, an instant gratification. They feel it automatically. The thing about that is it allows them to, what we call in science, is titrate their dose. It means they get to choose how high they want to be. And they're going to feel it immediately, so they can just stop smoking, not hold it in as long, not breathe it in as deep. Although they have actually started proving in some of the articles and the science research that has been done that holding the cannabis smoke in your lungs that everybody always talked about, that you have to hold it as long as possible, doesn't actually do any different. The THC is pulled into the blood basically immediately. Nobody has to hold that smoke in. It's just kind of what became the culture of cannabis users. But so the thing with all of the cannabis increasing in the concentration, people will smoke what they used to smoke, the same amount, they'll think, in their joint, in a bowl, in a bong, and suddenly they're much more high than they expected. The other thing, and Brian touched on this too, is the edibles. So the edibles are really the area that showed us as scientists that yes, cannabis truly is a hallucinogen. People just weren't taking a large enough dose. You may have seen online or in the news that there have been some cases now of people doing extraordinarily odd things under the influence of cannabis. And usually it comes back to them having taken edibles. People running around naked, jumping off balconies, just really bizarre behavior. And the problem is that Brian kind of touched on is that we call it an enteric usage. It means you eat it. So when you eat a drug compound, unlike when you smoke it, it's not immediate. It takes around 20 minutes or more. And there's a reason for that. You actually absorb most of the drug compound in your body in the small intestine. So you have to wait for the stomach to empty before that drug compound is going to hit the small intestine and be able to be absorbed. So people take, as Brian said, one edible, and that's usually what the dosage is supposed to be. And then they're like, well, I don't feel high. This sucks. I'm going to eat some more. And they eat a whole bunch more. Well, by the time something gets into your small intestine, you can throw up all you want, and it's not going to come out. So now you're stuck with this large dose that's now in your system. And that's when we're seeing...
Jennifer, this is Christina. And yeah, just to emphasize what you're saying, I know emergency rooms, when marijuana, these edibles are legalized in states, the emergency rooms will see an uptick in the marijuana-induced psychosis. But as I predicted, you are getting the most questions. So questions are flying in left and right. So some of them I'll wait because they're more related to lab testing. So when you get to that section, I'll hold these questions for then. But I did have one question on what is the difference between THC and CBD?
So I can actually show you I have a list of stuff. We'll kind of jump around my slides. So the thing about, there we go. THC starts out as the top one, tetrahydrocannabinol. Let's try that again. Cannabinolic acid. I actually do know how to say my science words, I swear. We usually deal with tetrahydrocannabinol, but this is cannabinolic acid. That's what's actually in the plant, is for THC. Now, the plant has, as you can see on the screen, over 100 known cannabinoids. There's a lot of them. If you look down, if you can see my pointer, down here at cannabidiol, this is CBD. Oop, I don't want to go there. So CBD is a different cannabinoid. It has different physical effects on the body. It has different psychological effects on the body. Some people feel it's safer. Whether or not that's actually true is kind of up in the air. Cannabidiol also comes as cannabidiolic acid. The plant keeps the cannabinoids generally mostly in an acidic form when they're in the plant itself. But when you burn it, it will then become the active compound that we want to have within our system if you're actually consuming cannabis to have an effect. The cannabidiol was used in the beginning process of the cannabis industry, kind of as that golden child, and people were just talking about it, just, you know, eliminating somebody's epilepsy, and that hasn't really been proven. They had a ton of stories about it, and it was kind of twisted a bit in the media because people really wanted that cannabis industry to take off. So that's the big difference between THC and CBD. THC is the main psychoactive cannabinoid contained in cannabis. When people really want to get high, that's what they're seeking out. They want delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. There is also, as you see right below it, a delta-8 tetrahydrocannabinol. That does have some effects, but not nearly as much. And it's produced in much lower quantities in the plant. People are trying to utilize delta-8, trying to say, oh, it's legal, it's fine. But the way that the actual Illinois statute reads, it reads that it's any and all cannabinoids that are contained within the plant material. So that's been kind of something I've been now navigating in the last, say, month and a half, maybe two, within the court system. I do testify a lot. I've testified in court over 100 times. So I tend to be one of the people who sees the trends early on as to what people are trying to do within the court system or do within trying to, quote unquote, legally consume things or legally sell things. So I hope that answers that question between THC and CBD. And you can always interrupt me if there's more questions. I love questions.
And a follow-up to that, how readily will CBD test positive for cannabis? Will it test positive for THC?
Depends upon the test that you're using. So this will kind of lead into the science part of it. And I'll keep it as simple as I can. The problem with testing is it depends upon the instrumentation that you use. So a lot of labs and some forensic labs will utilize these instruments as well, use something called an immunoassay technique. It can either be a MIT, which is an enzyme multiplied immunoassay technique, EMIT, or it can be ELISA, ELISA, which is an enzyme linked immunosorbent technique. Those words probably mean nothing to you. As I said, I'm the scientist, I speak Greek constantly. But the thing with immunoassays, the good thing is they're very fast. They're really easy instrumentations to use. Basically, you have no sample prep. You just take the urine, you can take blood. Usually with blood, you'll spin it down into serum, and you don't have to do anything. You just put it on the instrument. That's all you have to do. It's very, very simple. The problem with immunoassays, they have what we call cross-reactivity. Cross-reactivity means that more than one compound will give you a positive indication. The cannabinoid assay, probably a large amount of these cannabinoids will give a cross-reactivity on an immunoassay. That's great, but it also will not tell you what they're actually consuming. So it's like, because I should also say the metabolites also cross-react. There is one immunoassay, cannabinoid assay that cross-reacts with probiotics, think like stuff in yogurt, but some of them don't. I know the one that the state police uses here in Illinois, that doesn't. I used to work at the state lab, and the manufacturer for our immunoassay instrument actually reached out to us years ago when this first came up about the probiotics, because we were starting to see it in the court systems. So it really depends upon what technique you're using. If you get into a more, what would be a good way to say it, kind of sensitive or a more rigorous type of testing, in a forensic lab, we A, have to have 2 positive tests to be able to report anything. B, we have to have a full 100% identification of what is the compound that we saw. So we could use an immunoassay, but that would be a preliminary test for us. It'd be the first one we do. And we'd say, oh, hey, look, that came up positive for cannabinoids. I have to do a confirmation now. The confirmation would be done either on GC mass spec or LC-MS-MS. The trend is moving toward LC-MS-MS because it's much more sensitive. It's easier, I would say. It's what my lab uses. In that type of testing, the GC or the LC, you will see the difference between Delta 9 and CBD. And you will know, yes, this is Delta 9. No, it is not CBD. Whereas you won't know that from just an immunoassay test. Those actually look for, you can think of it as like a fingerprint of the molecule. That's the easiest way to kind of consider it. But it tells us distinctly, yes, it is this specific compound and it's no other compound. The cross-reactivity goes away when you start using those instruments. Problem is they're expensive and it's time-consuming. And you also have to do an extraction, which means you have to add a whole bunch of different chemicals and such to the urine or the blood and put it through a process of actually pulling your drug compounds out of what we call it a matrix, so out of the blood and out of the urine.
So I have another question, and that is, how do we get a lab or other tester to give us actual nanogram results for a urine test for random testing versus the pass-fail based on DOT standards?
So you need a lab that would have the capability of quantifying. I would caution when you talk to labs, ask what sort of instrumentation they use if you actually want a true full quantitation, because some people will interpret immunoassay as semi-quantitative. I kind of hate that word because it's like an oxymoron, doesn't really mean anything. And as I said, the immunoassays cross-react. So if somebody is using cannabis medicinally and chronically, even if it's for something that is, you know, just like cancer treatment or something, they're always going to have one of the metabolites in their system. That is going to cross-react on the immunoassay. And you could have a lab potentially tell you, oh, hey, yeah, they're above our 50 nanogram cutoff, but it's not going to tell you if it's Delta 9. I think Brian could probably, if he wanted to jump in, back me up, what he and I have seen in the court system. That's the big thing. The A7 statute is written only for Delta 9. It is not written for any other cannabinoid or metabolite. So out of these 113 known cannabinoids, that's the only one that is in that A7 statute. And when we go to court, we have to show, yeah, it's Delta 9. It's not anything else. It is only Delta 9. You do need to have instrumentation if you're doing the quantitation, usually LC-MS. GCs are great, but they have a lower threshold, or I guess I should say a higher threshold. They don't have as much sensitivity as an LC. That's why the toxicology community is moving toward LC-MS, because it is much more sensitive. It gives us a greater capability of being able to actually quantify. My lab does quantify Delta 9 in both blood and urine.
And I'll jump in there too, just kind of to back Jen up on this. So from a law enforcement perspective, when you're looking for evidentiary testing for our court cases, and if you want quantification, there are only a limited number of labs that will do it, and you got to pay for it. You know, the cost is reasonable for what we're trying to do on a law enforcement side of things. But you know, when you start looking at how often you're going to do this, if you're going to test every one of your employees and have them quantify this, what's the viability there? I think that's where you kind of run into an issue.
Yeah, that's true. The testing can get expensive, and you know, like Brian said, for law enforcement, you know, if you're dealing with like a fatal case, which unfortunately we deal with a lot. I mean, you saw Brian had those statistics of the fatalities that happen on the road. You know, you get into that thing of, okay, it's expensive, but we have somebody who died. So, you know, that kind of gives you a justification for, hey, I'm going to, you know, have the cost. I'm glad you said that, Brian, because that is the other thing you do want to look at when you're looking at labs and you find them. The pricing can sometimes be a bit shocking. Our instrumentation is expensive, and so that's where some of that pricing comes from. So yeah, unfortunately, we're not always cheap.
And I have another question. I know that the presentation is based more on marijuana and THC, but can you comment on, and I have no idea what this substance is, KRATOM?
Kratom. Yeah, I can. Like
Okay.
I said, I'm the resident nerd. You guys are all playing in my sandbox right now. This is my area. Kratom is a different plant material. I actually had a graduate student who did his master's thesis in kratom, looking at the different products that you can purchase. They're generally sold at health food stores, and it does give you a bit of a high. It is not, it should not, I would say. I don't know if anybody has actually done research. The other thing that Brian brought up, which is so important, into if kratom would cross-react with cannabinoids. I doubt it. The structure is very different, but it is a compound that people use to try to not hit positive on tests. When they know they'll be facing drug tests, they'll sometimes use kratom instead. It's an odd compound.
And just to chime in here too, from a law enforcement perspective, again, that may not fall under the A7 statute, obviously, because it's not cannabis. But if we do see impairment based off of someone using kratom or kratom, that they can still be arrested. It's just making sure that you have an officer that's well trained enough to be able to detect what's going on there, because that's not a typical thing that falls into, what we see all the time. But we do see it on the street. If you've ever seen it before, it's like a green, really fine powder. So if you see that in your workplace, you know what it is.
Yeah, people oftentimes will like brew it into like a tea or a drink, and then just kind of like slurp it down, which it just looks disgusting. Like even when my student was working with it, we were all kind of like, ooh, what is that? But yeah, it is something that people do use.
And I have one participant that's asked it for a list of accredited labs. I will go ahead and look into this and include that in a follow-up email.
If you're looking, which type of accreditation?
Well,
Because,
I presume to run the test that you've been talking about.
well, you can definitely find some of the forensic accredited labs that the state police recognize. I think that's up on their website somewhere. But if you just need something like SAMHSA or something, then that I wouldn't know. But
Yeah, it says list of qualified labs in Northern Illinois that municipalities can use and will provide drug test numbers.
Yeah, I'm more familiar with like forensic labs, and a lot of them won't do private testing. My lab is private. I was brought over from the state lab to UIC because they wanted to expand their lab that at the time only did racehorse testing. They wanted to get into human testing, so I was brought over to do that. But since we are private, we will take samples from anybody. But the one thing that I would caution people on, if you start reaching out to anybody who envisions themselves a crime lab, they may or may not accept just private samples. So just a bit of a caution there, so that you don't get too frustrated.
Got it. But just for everyone on the webinar, yeah, SAMHSA, I will send that webinar out, and those are all DOT accredited labs.
So if there's no more questions, I actually kind of segued into another thing that Brian had brought up, is like the research. He is absolutely 100% correct that the biggest hole we have right now, and it's kind of sad that cannabis just exploded. I actually have a more updated map than even what Brian had. This was updated in June of 2021. I know it's not the best resolution, but the biggest thing here is you can see there are only 3 states left that don't have some sort of a cannabis program in place. Like I said, this is from June of 2021, so June of this year. The big thing though, and what Brian touched on, is alcohol has been studied and studied and studied and studied. For me as an expert, I could bring you hundreds, if probably thousands of papers that have been done on alcohol, and they've done everything you can possibly think of. We know what ethanol does. We know how it affects people. We know what it looks like. Cannabis hasn't been studied as much simply because it's federally Schedule 1. Trying to get an approval as a scientist like myself, we love we're kind of very sadistic. We like studying people under the effects of drugs. It's what gives us information that helps us be better scientists. But trying to get the approval through the DEA and NIH is psychotically hard. It takes years. One of the studies that was being done a couple years ago that I did some testing for, they wanted to do a clinical trial. It had taken them over 6 years to get approval to be able to do the testing. And then when you do that type of testing, the DEA limits what type of product you can dose people with. So you have to use DEA cannabis. Well, that's still the cannabis from like the 1970s. It's 4, maybe 7%, that's it. So it's nothing like what we see on the streets. It's nothing like what we know people are using. It's nothing even that is similar to what's being sold in dispensaries around the country. So it doesn't really give us a good idea. We don't have enough research. It's, as a scientist, it's like the biggest hang up for me is we really, really want that data, because that's what allows me to be able to give you a good answer and feel confident about that answer. And it's just not there yet. We really need more research done. We need to understand better, what is it doing in the body? How is it affecting people? We're seeing so much stuff anecdotally with the officers and myself and the testing that I do here in the lab, but we really do need that research. I'll pause and see if there's a question or anything. All right, if not, I will quickly kind of, because I know we're kind of out of time, but I'll quickly talk about that saliva that Brian kind of brought up. He's right. The saliva testing seems like a great idea. It's non-invasive, it's easy, an officer could just collect it right on the side of the road, but it has pitfalls. As he said, it's just not advanced enough right now. We just don't have it advanced to have that sensitivity. My instrument that I quantify on, we have a quantitation limit of 1 nanogram per mil, and we can see things qualitatively down to 0.5. But my instrument costs about $500,000. So the saliva testing, it's just the sensitivity is not there, and it's the mouth contamination is the biggest problem. When I've spoken with other scientists who aren't in forensics, and I've asked them about the mouth contamination, they say, "Oh yeah, of course it has mouth contamination. It does make sense. Most people smoke cannabis." And I was like, well, but it's never going to forensically get into court that way. If it was used appropriately, just like similar to a PBT, it could be really, really powerful if it can have that sensitivity to be able to give like that probable cause and stuff. But it's, yeah, as Brian said, it's just not quite there yet. I'm sure in time it will be. We're always improving the technology within the science industries and within the testing industries. So I'm sure at some point somebody will get a test that is viable. It's just not yet there.
Hey, Jen, did you want to go into the science behind what the legislators looked at to make this 10 and 5 nanogram limit?
Oh, there's nothing. Literally. I made really good friends in Springfield one day many years ago when I got to meet with one of them, and I said, well, where did you pull the numbers from? They're like, oh, well, we just looked at like Colorado and Washington and stuff. And I'm like, but did you ask anybody who's a scientist if they would mean anything? And they're like, well, no. And I was like, well, why would you do that? And yeah, they didn't like me much, and that happens. But they really didn't talk to anybody who had an idea. Honestly, in the research and the literature studies that are now being published, 5 and 10 are probably too high. And that seems kind of shocking to a lot of people, but cannabis actually is absorbed into your brain very rapidly. I always make the joke that, if people would just like, give me a little bit of brains, just a tiny little bit, a little trumpeting. Yeah, no, nobody wants to do that for me. The issue is that your blood levels drop dramatically and really fast. We're talking 15, 20 minutes, they just plummet. But they have seen, and there is a Department of Justice study out, as well as a bunch of literature studies, they're still seeing signs of impairment. So a DRE can clue in on somebody being under the influence of cannabis, and when they bring blood to me, I may or may not find it. Sometimes I do, oftentimes I do. I mean, now with how much people are consuming, it's much more likely for me to find it, but it is possible to not find it and still have somebody show the signs of impairment. I would say that that's why I really do support that DRE program that Brian talked about. I've been involved in assisting with like presentations with them, and I work really closely with a lot of Brian's officers specifically, but other DREs and other police agencies, and they're great. As he said, they are passionate about what they want to do and what they do, and they are fabulous at what they do. Watching them do an actual evaluation is fascinating, because you'll learn things that you were like, wow, I'm a scientist, and I was even like blown away.
I just, and this is Jeff, just to on this topic. I mean, the Illinois legislature is relying on the vehicle code as sort of an easy button or switch to this from an employment standpoint. They continue to refer to the vehicle code, and in the draft legislation that I'm sensitive to, and it's still to be determined how that ultimately is going to look going into 2022, that basically will say a positive test alone is, you can't do anything with it unless there's other signs of impairment, and unless the THC exceeds the legal limits under the Illinois Vehicle Code. So they, and as they say that, there's also the, and oh, by the way, that Illinois Vehicle Code seems to be pretty darn low. So I think they're eyeing maybe trying to change those limits under the vehicle code, but that's just me, guessing and speculating based on rumblings in Springfield that I'm hearing.
All right, well, that actually brings us right up to 11:30. I want to again thank our panelists, who obviously have an extreme amount of expertise in the area. I did want to mention that Jeff Risch and Smith Amundsen have lots of nice resources, so feel free to contact him if you need to either establish or shore up your written drug-free workplace program. Corkhill Insurance is poised and ready to provide reasonable suspicion training for supervisors. Commander Cluever had mentioned that well-trained police officers are really the key to enforcing drug laws and DUI out there, and so your supervisors in your workplaces are really the key to your reasonable suspicion testing program as well. I do want to make a distinction here between reasonable suspicion training for shop foremen or construction foremen versus DOT, DER reasonable suspicion training. That is a 2-hour training required by the Department of Labor if you have any federally controlled drivers. So again, thank you, panelists. This has been a tremendous resource for everyone in attendance. You did great, and everyone have a terrific and safe holiday season. No drinking and driving. All right, take care.